Hey everybody, how's it going? So this is my first time speaking from the Pork Fest Pavilion, but hopefully I do a good job. You guys will be the judge of that. But I'd like to start with a mover story. I come from the people's state of New York originally, and it's a terrible place and I never wish to return. I don't even like driving through that place. And on occasion, people sometimes call me a carpetbagger. And I tell them, though I may have been born in New York, I plan to die in New Hampshire. But I moved over a decade ago, and I've really adapted to the community, not just the Pork Fest freedom fighter community, but also to the general New Hampshire community. And I think that's an important thing for anybody who moves here to do. Meet your neighbors. Don't just hang out with the Liberty people. Hang out with all the normal people, too. Because guess what? You are the normal people, too. And that's going to be a large theme in my talk, is moving the Liberty community from an insular community to one that is leaders in the space of New Hampshire politics, and hopefully leaders in the space of world politics. And in order to do that, we need to start talking to our neighbors. So, in 2020, some interesting things happened. You guys might have remembered. There was a global panic, and people went a little bit nuts there for a while. And it was during that year that I made the conscious decision and came to the conscious conclusion that I am, in fact, the adult in the room. And many of you guys may have come to similar conclusions, but watching the elected politicrators and how they decided to go about things, I decided, yeah, I could do a better job. I am actually more responsible than them. I am actually better under pressure than they are. So, after having my arm twisted a little bit, because I didn't want to deprive Glenn Bailey of a job, I decided to run for state representative. We picked up a seat in that district, so it was something that was possible to do. So I ran in 2022, I won, and when I first had that job, being a state rep, for those who are unaware or aren't from New Hampshire, a state rep gets paid $100 a year. That's it. It's a true citizens legislature run by volunteers for the most part. And that doesn't mean that it's super easy to win, because guess what? There's some tough races out there. If you're in a tough district, you might lose. But it does mean that it is only made up by people who actually care and who actually want to make a difference in the world. It isn't made up by career politicians who are looking to line their own pockets. Because unless you're a real big crook, you can't make money in politics in New Hampshire. Not by running for office at any rate. Maybe you can as a lobbyist or running a PAC, but you definitely can't do it by winning an election. So when I first became a state rep, people who were around in that biennium know it was a very weird year. The Republican Party was virtually tied with the Democrats, which means that we have a lot of interesting things happen. Who is in the majority that day depended on who showed up. Whoever showed up won the day. And we also had this strange thing happen where we found out that Republicans are likely to be older, and therefore they leave earlier. And the reason they do this is because if you become advanced in your years, you find out you have a harder time driving at night. And so we would find that this is one of the reasons anyway, that throughout the day, we would bleed votes faster than the Democrats. And so every day became a race to see if we had more people in the morning, we would try to pass and jam through all the legislative priorities that were on the docket for that day as early as possible and as quickly as possible. And it was a very, very strange biennium. Those who have seen it, there's not many legislators in the world that have seen a truly tied House, but those who have, they remember it either fondly or the opposite. But I learned a lot from that. And one of the lessons I learned is that we cannot do it alone. We will never have enough Liberty people move to New Hampshire where we will have more votes than everybody else. It's not going to happen. In order for us to succeed, we must convince them with sound arguments and with sympathy and empathetic understanding of their position that we're right about something. And that is where the Liberty movement has really grown in the House. It was the case over a decade ago that we had a large amount of Liberty legislators, and I wasn't in the House at this time, so this is secondhand knowledge, keep that in mind. But the Liberty section of the Republican Party largely acted in a terroristic manner. they had the ability to kill bills occasionally if the numbers were suitable, right? They weren't able to just inflict their will on the House. They weren't able to just do whatever they wanted because they didn't have the numbers and they weren't leaders within the Republican Party, all right? It's changed a bit since then. It's been a gradual process, but there is no longer a very solid distinction between a Liberty legislator and a Republican legislator. And I think that's nothing but a good thing. So let's talk about dots and in-group favoritism. There was a study performed in the 70s where they took participants and they showed them a screen filled with dots, randomly located, like 100, 200, 500, but more than they were able to count quickly. They then, and they only showed it for a second, so they couldn't sit there and count them all. They then said that they were either an overestimator or an underestimator. And they also did this arbitrarily. They didn't actually base it on whether or not they accurately overestimated or underestimated. And then they had those guys interact, the overestimators and the underestimators. Even though there was essentially no difference between the two groups, the fact that they considered themselves separate groups led to struggles and fighting between the groups, where one group would show in-group favoritism for the other overestimators and would tilt the odds against the underestimators. Now, why is this important? How many people here would never call themselves a Republican? Let's see a raise of hands. Okay. You're entitled to that. Let me try to convince you that that might not be a good way to go about it. By saying that you're not a Republican, through that same exact logic, you have just set yourself up as an underestimator in a world of overestimators. You are essentially saying that you should not consider my opinion because I am in the out group. And what we found in the House, and what has played out in this experiment over and over again, year after year, is that you must be on the same team. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to buy every single idea and every single notion that every Republican comes up with. I'm still opposed to war. I don't think we should be bombing Iran. I'm a Republican, but I don't think we need to bomb Iran. But what it does mean is you need to work with them to try to get to a solution that works for everybody. All right? And then what you'll find is people will listen to you. All right? So if you have a Republican, you can take one of the more left-wing Republicans, more moderate Republicans in the House, and if they have a bill that I disagree with, and people in here who have been in the legislature know this, they probably have a core of goodness in that bill that they're pursuing. There is probably an idea in that bill that they're pushing that I won't actually disagree with. So if you talk to them early when the bill is introduced and you try to work with them, chances are you will find a way to actually accomplish what they're after without any anti-liberty anything. And you know what happens when you do that? You develop trust because you just help their bill pass. You just help them secure the votes necessary for their priority to go through. And you know what they're going to do in the future when your bill comes up? They're going to help your priorities go through as well. And this is what the difference is between keeping your principles and only voting how you think the right way is. They're like, okay, this doesn't match my principles, vote down. Okay, this matches my principles, vote up. And the difference between that and the real way we should be going about it, which is trying to get things to conform to the principles before it actually gets to a vote. Because you can have as many principles, you can be as strictly principled as you want, but if you can't get the votes for your priorities, you will lose. Everyone in here has been a libertarian for probably a while. How many people have been a libertarian for over a decade? See, we got a lot. How often have you lost? Almost every time. Never. Well, I can take some tips from you then. I'm sick of losing, but losing is part of the game. Even if you follow the strategies that work, even if you pay attention to what other people on your team are up to, you can still lose. But you can also pick up some wins. And there's also an interesting effect that isn't widely talked about. Libertarians dropping the name libertarian, calling themselves a Liberty Republican, joining the Republican caucus, and working with Republicans where they agree, and not fighting each other and instead trying to figure out a way where everybody wins, what that eventually ends up doing is it has a catalyst effect. Because a lot of Republicans, it's not as though they sat down and they figured out their philosophy and they read some J.K. Rowling and C.S. Lewis and they were going through all their old books on Thomas Jefferson and they have their old, they're not like, oh, well, what did Hobbes say about this subject? No, that's what libertarians do. They read Rothbard, they read Ayn Rand, they think about their ideas, they debate their ideas, and they come to what they consider, either rightly or wrongly, depending on your point of view, the correct philosophy. Republicans generally don't do that. So what happens when you have somebody who is very solid on what they know the difference between right and wrong, and they can defend it. You can give them an arbitrary scenario, and they can try to discern the best way forward and what is morally correct and morally wrong in that scenario. And you put them with people who ran for office, as Senator Brakey said, because they were the favorite tennis instructor in the town. They get radicalized. Because guess what? Maybe they haven't thought about this that much before. Maybe there's a new bill that'll implement a sales tax, right? And maybe they were told, this is a recent example for anybody who's been reading their emails, legislators. Let's say that you don't want property taxes to go up. And you have been told that the best way to prevent property taxes from going up is if New Hampshire implements a sales tax. And then we can fund municipalities through a sales tax. That could be true in a theoretical sense. Maybe it is possible to do that. But then you have the Liberty people come in and say, well, okay, so here's how this actually works. You get both a sales tax and a property tax. Okay, that's an argument that is made. Somebody else makes the argument, okay, so we can't really bind a future legislature. So if we pass a sales tax, and we'd have to get rid of property taxes at the same exact time, and we'd have to get the number right, otherwise we would be crushing the towns with debt or we would put the state out of business. Okay. And then you have other people making arguments, no, never do that, because as soon as you implement a sales tax, then you're going to end up with both. And this is very similar to the patches of the 16th Amendment, where we got income taxes and tariffs as a result. And then you look at the people who are making those arguments, and they're not exactly liberty people. Why are they making those arguments? Because they are arguments that were made in the past, when this topic was discussed before, that were convincing. They didn't read Rothbard. They didn't read Ayn Rand. They didn't read Friedman. I love David Friedman, but I don't think they read him. And they came to the conclusion because the argument itself was good. Because they may not read every book that you read, and they may not buy into every philosophical argument you make, but if you text them as a member of their team, or send them an email as a member of their team, making a case for why this would not work or why it's a bad idea, they will read that. And if you're making good arguments and you have a background in philosophy and you've studied economics for fun and you know the difference between Austrian economics and Keynesian economics and you know why Marxism is a failure every time it's been tried, then you will be in there equipped with the knowledge that you need to convince them that you're right on a certain topic. And you may find that they may know more about other things than you do, and you may find yourself convinced that they're right sometimes. And guess what? When you do that, when you're able to change your mind based on new information and new arguments that are made by a more moderate Republican, guess what? You're just doing the same thing you're expecting them to do. That's what we should do. We should change our mind when new information and new arguments are being brought up. Because sometimes the Republicans, the regular old neocons, have even been right about something once or twice. Doesn't happen often with the neocons, but. And on the topic of opinions, how many of you guys have heard the joke that if you put 10 libertarians in a room and introduce a topic, the libertarians will walk out with 11 different opinions? I bet I could come up with any number of scenarios where most of the people in this room would disagree with each other. And you guys could argue about it, and libertarians are famous for arguing about it. But the interesting thing about the libertarian arguments is that, unfortunately, they're never really resolved, and they don't result in any policy changes. So essentially, you have a scenario where, as much fun as arguing is, it doesn't actually lead anywhere. And a lot of you guys have probably done this week. You have probably gotten into a very interesting discussion where you've made an argument, someone else has made a counter-argument, yada, yada, yada. Okay, well, if you do that with Republicans, and if you put 10 let me step back. You put 5 regular moderate Republicans in a room and 5 libertarian Republicans in a room, and then you give them a motion. Guess how many opinions they walk out with? 11. You know why? Because they're different people, and they have different opinions on the subject, and some people change their minds. So what makes the distinction? Why do we even have the distinction? If the distinction manages to convince people to disregard your arguments because you're on the out team, you're in the out group, and if the argument doesn't actually get paid attention to because you're on the other team, then why do you need to have a separate label for yourself? Why do we even need it? I work in politics. And I think the answer is that you don't. Let's talk about democracy a little bit. And I love Glenn Bailey so much, I'm gonna keep bringing up his anecdotes because he makes the best anecdotes. He's in the back and he's listening. Let's say you're in Athens, thousands of years ago, and democracy hasn't been invented yet. And who wins the day is based on whoever wins a battle, right? So you have your big army over here, and they have their big army over here, and you're trying to decide who gets some parcel of land or something like that. Well, an interesting trick is to count how many soldiers are on their team, and then count how many soldiers are on your team, and whoever has the bigger number is probably going to win. That's how battles usually work. Bigger armies win. It doesn't always happen that way, but it's a good rule of thumb. So what if you decided to just count all the people on the opposing team and your team, and then just skip the battle and just declare whoever has the bigger army is actually the winner? That's how democracy was invented, everybody. So you have that sort of system, and over time it's sort of evolved and moved, and I like to believe that we live in a republic, not a democracy, but you take what is the contrast between a democracy and a republic, right? So in a republic, there are certain things that are recognized as things the mob cannot touch, certain inalienable rights, certain standards of procedure that are not the sort of thing that are subject to mob rule. Just because you have more votes doesn't mean that you can change this. I'll give you an example. It doesn't matter how many votes you have, the Second Amendment should still be protected, right? Freedom of speech, things like that. Can the New Hampshire legislature, by 2/3 majority, decide to throw away the Constitution and implement a new one? No, because we live in a republic, and the Constitution is where we derive our authority. Don't want to get too down the legal rabbit hole, but you get the difference. So you have the idea of a republic, and you may say, well, that still might makes right. You can say, well, this still isn't a perfectly voluntary society. That's true. That is true. You're correct. And you may say that you're an anarcho-capitalist, and you think that what we should have is competing firms that are fighting against each other in order to provide the best service, rights protection agencies that compete on an open market in order to provide the best police services and justice services. Now, that's a pretty cool system, but it has one fatal flaw, and I really like David Friedman, and I think that he has a very good system, and I think he acknowledges this is the case, and so hopefully he's not offended by me saying it, but the simple fact of the matter is that system doesn't actually exist. The republic actually does. And you have a system that is real, that is capable of protecting the rights of the individual. So, would I be willing to try out an anarcho-capitalist experiment? Maybe if it was on the ballot, maybe if it had the votes, maybe if people made the right arguments, sure. But we don't live in that world. We don't have the votes. What we do have the votes to do, however, is do things that are well within the Overton window but haven't been done yet. And we have the votes to just move the Overton window a little bit to the right. Nudge it a little bit further towards liberty. And if we do that long enough, eventually the Overton window will be directly over the area. And will we ever get everything we want? Will we ever get Ancapistan? No, probably not. Heaven isn't found here on earth. You're probably not going to find it here. We don't have, there is no area in life where you will win on everything. You will lose something because we live in an imperfect world and we're imperfect people. But you will get a lot closer to what you're after. And I think that is a worthy and noble goal. So when you try to comprehend politics and when you're getting involved in politics, it is incredibly important that you stick to what is real and don't get befuddled by the imaginary. If you have a good, strong way of discerning what is true and what is factual and what is actually existing in the real world from that which is perhaps very enticing but imaginary, you will do very well. Now let's talk about the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance for a little bit. Who here lives in New Hampshire? Oh, we got a lot of you. Who here is a potential mover and is thinking about moving? Oh, we got a couple. You should join us. Now, who here doesn't know what the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance is? We got a couple. The reason the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance is well known among people in New Hampshire is because the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance does something very, very interesting. What they do is they have a team of volunteers. Many of the people here have worked as volunteers. I used to be the political director. I used to sit on the board and work as on the political side. And what they do is they go through every bill that is submitted in the New Hampshire House and Senate and rate them as either pro-liberty or anti-liberty based on liberty principles. And what that has a tendency to do over time is give us clear indication of where the winds are blowing. They then take this information and they put it in something called the gold standard, which I use as a whip. That's my job. I use it as a whip. And they give it to the legislature. They stand outside the doors of the House and they give this gold standard with voting recommendations saying, this bill's good, this bill's bad. This is a pro-liberty bill, this is a bad one. And in each one, they have arguments backing up their position. It used to be the case when the NHLA was new that most legislators didn't vote the way the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance said they should vote. But what happened over time was that the scores started improving because they can take the voting record, the roll calls that are associated. Let me back up. Let me make sure that you understand this. If you are a legislator and you vote a specific way on a bill on a roll call vote, then that's on the record, and people can see that you voted that way on this specific motion. Now, what organizations like the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance can then do is they can take that data and then show who voted how over time. And they can aggregate this data. They can do statistics with this data. And they can show that, hey, this legislator, he votes with the NHLA 90% of the time. This guy votes against the NHLA 100% of the time. And then they can provide that to voters. And they can start doing endorsements. And they can say, if you want pro-liberty legislators elected, you vote for these guys. You vote for Kaczynski. That's who you vote for. He's great. You vote for Gerhard for sheriff. That's what you do. And over time, since you have a history of these scores, you can quantify the impact that having this strategy makes, or quantify the impact of this strategy. What we find is that in the beginning of the NHLA, most legislators voted against the NHLA most of the time, and the best legislators maybe voted with us a little bit over half the time. That's improved dramatically. And since 2016, a major shift has happened. There used to be this big argument in liberty circles about left liberty versus right liberty, as though left liberty exists. And I know some people still believe that left liberty is something that can exist, but the very first NHLA-endorsed candidate was a Democrat, all right? They are no longer considered a libertarian or a liberty republic or a liberty Democrat even by anybody. But over time, what we find is the Republican caucus, the GOP, the grand old party, consistently moves towards a pro-liberty angle. And the reason isn't because they're afraid of a scorecard. It's because the arguments are effective, and over time, they become convinced. And what we also find is that something happened in 2016, and the Democrats have dive-bombed. And I don't know exactly what happened in 2016. I can't think of any major political events that could have caused this. But it's been consistent ever since. If you pull up the actual statistics and rank all 400 legislators in the House based on their compliance with the liberty rating, what you find is the lower half is exclusively Democrats, the upper half is exclusively Republicans. You might find one Democrat that beats one Republican on a few times, but that's basically it. And what does this tell us? That tells us that the liberty message is especially conducive to Republican lawmakers. It resonates with them. You talk to them and you make the argument, there's something in their heart that while they haven't read Rothbard, it speaks to them. And that's something that can grow over time. And to give an example of this, I actually have a spreadsheet up just so I can give you an example. But of all the Republicans, the worst Republican, by a liberty rating standard, in the New Hampshire House, voted with the Liberty Alliance over 50% of the time. All right? The average, so if you're talking about people who have voted with the Liberty Alliance 3/4 of the time or better, would you guys consider someone who votes with Liberty 3/4 of the time a pretty good Liberty guy? It's all right. Yeah, that's at least 200 members of the House. Right? That's half, right? This is what you get over time if you just make the arguments. But you cannot do that if you alienate them. You have to be friends with them. You have to be friends with them and you have to work with them. And you have to understand where they're coming from. All right? So let's talk about the unions. Right now this year in the New Hampshire House, the biggest schism in the House, Republican caucus, is over the topic of unions. And I don't want to get into the specifics of the bills, but there are what we call, some people call unionists, Republicans, who vote with the unions, and some people accuse them of voting with the unions over their own constituents. Usually, those Republicans have a tendency to score worse on the liberty rating than the ones who are not beholden to the unions. But every last one of those unionists have helped a priority bill get passed. Every last one of those unionists helped us get universal EFAs. Every last one of those unionists worked with us to get a parental bill of rights passed so the government can stop interfering with parental rights. And so you have to ask yourself, is it really worth fighting them? You can argue with them, you can debate them, you can say you're wrong about something, but is it right to say that they suck, or that they're bad, and that this person is a rhino, or whatever the case may be? I would say no, not until primary season, then go nuts. And this goes to another point that I kind of want to close on. The typical virtues and values that make a good person are also very conducive to being effective in politics. So if you make a deal, for instance, and you say, look, this budget that you're going through, I will not vote for it unless it includes this, unless it includes a car inspection repeal, unless it includes getting rid of vaccine rulemaking, unless it includes X, Y, Z. You have to stick to that, all right? You have to be predictable because they want that bill to pass, all right? And if you renege on your agreement after they have worked tirelessly to try to accommodate your whims, you cannot change your mind. If you were here earlier, you might have heard Friedman talk about commitment strategies. Well, this is one. If you commit to not voting for the budget, if the budget doesn't meet certain criteria, that means that if it does meet those criteria, you must vote for the budget. All right? But it's all, and that builds trust. You do that over time, the other Republicans begin to trust you. And over time, that means that when you say something, you mean it. And when you say that and when you work with them, and they know that they can try to work to accommodate your wants, that you'll actually do what you say and vote with them on something, then that means they're much more likely to do so. And that brings us to where we want to bring the liberty movement in the House and in the Senate. We are no longer a minor caucus that goes around trying to kill specific bills and trying to get weed passed. We are the leaders in the GOP. And you cannot be a leader in the GOP unless you are working underneath everyone in the GOP to serve them, right? I know that sounds counterintuitive, but it turns out that when you're on top, you're actually on the bottom. Shit may roll downhill, but it also goes on up. You cannot be a leader unless you're willing to follow. And so, with that, I'll take any questions. Hello, sir. Hi. Hit it. There we go. There we go.
Thank you for being here. I appreciate you discussing this. Everything you said makes perfect sense. We've definitely seen a lot of great fiscal policies, less regulation, generally a liberty pointing direction. But my one detraction is, can you think of a soundly libertarian position that generally disagrees with traditional conservatism that has passed, let's say, in the last 20 years? I mean, an example would be marijuana. I'm not going to do the whole prostitution thing. That's way off the kilter. But anything that's like that, where you've convinced a conservative to support a soundly libertarian position that might otherwise lean to the left. Thank you.
So that's a good question. I will say this about marijuana. It passes the House every time it is brought up because we have successfully convinced enough Republicans that it is a worthy thing to pass. It's reliably going to get about 2/3 of the vote because you're going to include a lot of Democrats and you're going to include a large chunk of Republicans. The problem in there is the Senate. The Senate works a lot slower. So while the Liberty Caucus may have some level of leadership in the House, that is not so much the case in the Senate. And so that is where marijuana legalization usually dies. As far as other things, we had an interesting situation recently where a very pro-cop Republican, Representative Terry Roy, wanted to get mandatory minimums on fentanyl passed. And this was specifically a bill about fentanyl dealers, right? So if you were a fentanyl dealer and you gave fentanyl to someone and then they died, that there would be a mandatory minimum of sentence. Now, that's not pro-liberty, but there's another side of it, right? So we had Representative Verville, and he's the psilocybin guy. He really likes mushrooms. And so what he did was, Representative Terry Roy, he's smart enough to know that this would not get past the House because the Democrats would oppose it, and a certain large percentage of Liberty Republicans would oppose it. So he started talking to people, and Representative Verville did the same, and they came to an agreement. They would tie those two issues together. They would legalize small amounts of psilocybin so you don't get a felony for possessing magic mushrooms. And in exchange, they would put it in the same exact bill as one that gets criminal drug dealers who are selling fentanyl that kills people off the streets. All right? Now, is that a good trade? I think so. I thought it was a pretty good trade. It passed the House. Now, of course, the Senate killed it. But it passed the House. As for another bill, the biggest bill this year for me is HB 649, which deals with car inspections. The majority of the Republican caucus historically has opposed any elimination of vehicle inspections. But this year was something special. And sound arguments, sound data, and good discussion on the topic of vehicle inspections convinced them to pass a full repeal. The current status of that bill is, it is in the budget that we're going to be voting on next week. If the budget passes and it goes to Kelly Ayotte, who is the governor of New Hampshire, and she signs it, we will officially be completely rid of vehicle inspections in New Hampshire. And some people here work pretty hard on that. And so there's a lot of examples of that. Those are just three that come to mind. But overall, there are about 1,000 bills a year on various policy topics. And almost any one of them, the influence is there.
Hi, Waldo here.
Where are you?
In New Hampshire, you don't find Waldo. Waldo finds you.
Oh, okay.
So in a lot of polity, like in the federal Congress, the left-right split is roughly 50-50. And you're talking about how the Liberty Caucus within the state House has grown over time to being about half of the GOP, about a quarter of the House in total. Is that about right, figures-wise?
It depends on how exactly you measure it, but it's pretty big. It's over 100.
Okay, cool. Say over the next generation, do you see it reaching like an equilibrium, like it being 50%, or going? How big do you think the Liberty Caucus can get in the state House?
I think that the Liberty Caucus is on the way up. And I think that the Liberty Caucus is now intrinsically tied to the health of the GOP in the state. So that means that the bigger the Liberty Caucus gets, the bigger the GOP gets. Now, I foresee a potential problem in the future, which is a better problem to have. I believe that the enemies of liberty, if this becomes a truly red state, will simply switch sides and run as Republicans in some district. And that means that you're in a very strange scenario where you can't just point at the obvious bad guy, right? So one thing that really unites a caucus is having a common foe. And if it ever gets to the point where 3/4 of the New Hampshire House, for instance, is Republican, then we will no longer have an obvious common foe that we need to drive through and defeat. And if that happens, it's very likely that there would be severe fracturing within the Republican Party. But that's a future problem that I don't want to deal with right now. As far as national politics, one thing that is interesting about New Hampshire is that we have a first-in-the-nation primary. That means when presidents run for office, they need to stop here first and convince New Hampshire voters to vote for them. And the more effect that we have on the culture in New Hampshire, the stronger they're going to be messaging on liberty. And you can already see fruits in that because, what can I say, the Libertarian Party, which shouldn't exist by the way, basically endorsed Donald Trump this year. They did as good of an endorsement of Donald Trump as you could expect to get. So I think that that's a trend, and I think that it's good to go forward in the future. I'm glad that many libertarians have come around to politics as something they can't avoid.
Thank you for your words about the democracy. That's a really good analogy of talking about two armies that are opposing each other rather than having the gigantic losses that you do from a battle. Why don't you just have a vote and settle it? Now, I want to ask about this from a philosophical but also a pragmatic standpoint. The pragmatic standpoint is that with the demographic collapse that the Western world is facing in terms of fertility rates, where you have fewer and fewer workers taking care of more and more elderly people, and you have elderly people voting themselves benefits, including my own father. So I had a conversation with my father. He's kind of libertarian-leaning Republican, but not really, because I asked him, would you, even if you know that Social Security is going to collapse and it's really bad for the country and it's really bad for young people and all this stuff, would you vote to repeal it? And he said, of course, no. I want my Social Security that I paid for, even though he knows logically that that's not his money. His money has already been paid out to past retirees. He knows all that, but still he will not vote to repeal it. So the army analogy begs the question, shouldn't it just be, young men of fighting age that should be the voters, or should it be should the vote be proportional to how much tax you pay so that there's no conflict of interest between being required to pay taxes that you don't get influence over in terms of how it's spent, or you get to vote yourself benefits but don't have to pay the taxes for them, or at least restrict the voting population to those who at least are net contributors to the tax base. Has there been any movement in New Hampshire around that? At least at the state level. I don't know if New Hampshire has the authority to define who can vote. Maybe they don't, but I just wonder if people have been thinking about that, or if it's possible to change that, at least in New Hampshire.
I have been thinking about it. However, I would not endorse any changes to the current way elections are done in regards to who is allowed to vote. And I think that's very important to keep sort of static for now. Now, that being said, I can foresee a potential future where if too many problems are shifted off on the fighting age males, and eventually the Army might realize that, there's a shortcut here. The metaphor of having two competing armies no longer lines up. The fighting age males can just do it. I do not want that to happen. I do not like big wars. I do not like battles. And as much as the Democrat caucus seems to be intent on absolutely throwing young men under the bus, I do not think that it is appropriate, especially right now, for young men to rise up and take over, even though they probably have the firepower and the strength to do so, because that would not be a sound ending, and it would lead to a society with much bigger problems than the one we're having right now.
Do you see a way to at least improve the democratic situation, without doing that?
I believe that one thing that we can do is make sure that that people who are allowed to vote are properly identified. Kids will be kids. Hello.
We love that there are so many Free State families and that people are bringing their kids to Pork Fest. So
I love it.
thank you for bringing your children. We're glad. And I agree with whatever point he's making. Two questions for you. Of course, I'm an expert on Maine politics, but now that I'm here in New Hampshire, I'm learning quite a bit. I'm a rookie with New Hampshire politics and still trying to make sense of all the players and all the cogs in motion and all of that. You mentioned the budget, and I was very glad to hear that the repeal of the vehicle inspection is in the budget, and you said if the governor signs it. I know I just saw a video the other day that she's saying she's going to veto the budget because it doesn't spend enough money. I'm curious, one, what you make of that, and two, what you think potentially is the aftermath if the Republican governor does veto the Republican budget because it doesn't spend enough money. I had a second question, but I don't remember what it is, so I'll just
There's a
leave you with
question in
that
there.
one.
So I take it that this video is going to go on the internet after the budget is all done, right?
There's a live stream right now,
Okay.
so you may want to be judicious with your words. I don't want to put you in an awkward political position, but yeah, then it will be cut and published later online.
So I will say this. In order for it to get to the governor's desk in the first place, it needs to pass the House and the Senate. I'm not entirely sure. I do not have enough eyes in the Senate, and I do not want to say how they're going to behave with this, and I do not know exactly what the numbers are going to be in the House. I will say that for the Liberty Caucus, I am obligated to work with the caucus, and I am obligated, because of the honor and trust and all that they place in me, to do what they decide to do. And so that means that we're going to have a caucus on Sunday to decide whether the Liberty Caucus is going to be voting for the budget. If it were just up to me, I would say yes. I think my math is good. I think that the budget is good and it has enough sugar on top to make it easy to swallow. However, I am not the king of the Liberty Caucus. I have to vote. I have to work with the people on my team. If the Liberty Caucus votes for it, and everybody else votes for it except for the people that would obviously oppose it, and it makes it through the House, and it was going through the governor's desk, what we would need to do is really tell her, we need this done. So the reason that she opposes the budget is for Group 2. I don't want to get into the specifics of retirement and pensions because it's incredibly boring, but essentially this would benefit about 1,500 first responders that feel as though they have been wronged in the past. And they do have some standing for that claim. There is, in fact, they did get a raw deal a little bit. But that would be at a massive expense to taxpayers. Now, if you ask yourself, how many votes do 1,500 first responders have? 1,500. They have 1,500. How many people are in New Hampshire that support eliminating vehicle inspections? Huge. Much bigger than 1,500, a little bit bigger. So it would really boil down to whether we can convince the governor that it is a bigger priority to respect those who want to get rid of the inspections or respect those 1,500 that feel that they have been wronged. And I can't make that decision for her. She'll do what she'll do. But that's the status of it.
Great. And I remember my second question, which is about Manchester, which has been very interesting to watch since I've come here. Right, the biggest city in New Hampshire, the Democratic gubernatorial candidate this past year was the mayor of Manchester previously. And now Manchester has a Republican mayor and like 2 Republican state senators who are both like Liberty people. And I'm just very curious, like for someone who's got a more longer term perspective of kind of the state politics, is something strange and positive happening in Manchester? Like what should we make of this?
So I don't go to Manchester very often, but I do have some sort of insight on it. And my understanding is that the biggest issue that helped the mayor of Manchester win his race was the homeless issue. Because after 2020, with all the economic changes that happened, city of Manchester became overrun with ne'er-do-wells and street camping, and people don't like that. And that worked greatly towards helping him win his campaign. I sure hope that this is a broader trend, and I sure hope that he is able to run that city well enough that he can earn the trust of the people there, that we can turn this into a victory going forward so we can get more Liberty senators elected, more Liberty reps elected out of Manchester. Unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't know if this is a general trend or if this is a one-off. I sure hope it's a trend.
All right, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering, what issues do you see as an opportunity to secure liberty wins through consensus with legislators on the left?
Can you say that again?
So we talk about securing liberty wins through finding issues that we agree on with Republicans. Are there some issues where we can advance liberty by working with the Democrats?
They show up occasionally, and I'm perfectly willing to work with any one of my colleagues in the House. But from my perspective, it is far more important. This is my math on the subject. How often does the Republican Party win an election versus a Democrat? Roughly 50% of the time. So if we make it so the Republican Party is basically 100% liberty, then we're winning 50% of the time. And at that point, we can maybe work on trying to move the Democrat Party in a good direction. But as of right now, they seem to be really good at just shooting themselves in the foot. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but the Democrat Party has gone off the deep end, especially since 2016, and they no longer seem to have any semblance of sanity or rationality. And when you're in the House with them and you see how they vote and you see how they talk, and they're a little bit nuts, most of them. I will say this, though. The Democrat Party is run by a core group of mostly unionists, so pro-union people that are capable of getting that caucus together and occasionally picking up a win. It's not always the case, but it's frequently the case. So in the long term, I do not see trying to take over the Democrat Party or anything like that, or even having significant influence on the Democrat Party as a winning proposition, because as the old saying goes, Republicans may fall in love, but Democrats fall in line.
I will start by saying I'm a little conflicted here. I would very much support legislation or even a constitutional amendment that says every bill must have a single subject, so that a bill has to pass based on its own merits. On the other hand, that presumes that there would be a reasonable Senate. If you're going to introduce legislation like that, could you do it after the mandatory inspections are repealed?
There was a moment when I was thinking about what to call this talk, and I was and one of the topics I thought about was how I'd learn to stop worrying and love the omnibus. So this goes to commitment strategies if you were here for David Friedman's talk, I watched it, so that's why it's fresh on my mind. But there really is a commitment strategy, right? So there's this strange occurrence that happens in the House. So, I'm just a bill, I'm on Capitol Hill. So you imagine that bill, it starts in one chamber, let's say it's a House bill, all right? It goes to a committee. The committee studies that topic, it looks at the legislation, it analyzes the language, and decides whether or not they want it to pass or fail. Now in New Hampshire, every bill gets a floor vote. Every bill gets a floor vote one way or another. The House will overall vote on the motion. So let's say that the committee says this bill ought to pass, and the House votes on it and it passes. It then goes over to the Senate. And in the Senate side, they say, nah, we're not passing this. This is bad, we're killing it. And then they kill it. Okay, but the Senate just sent us over a bill. They sent over their Senate bills, right? So what do we do now? Well, we could just kill their Senate bill in anger. We could just be like, well, revenge, we're killing your bill. And we call that puppy killing. And or what you could do is you could take the bill that they killed and put it into this new bill they sent over. So then you send it over, and you can say, listen, this was the case with the mandatory minimum bill that I mentioned earlier. The Senate passed over a mandatory minimum bill for fentanyl, the one I described earlier for the drug dealers who get somebody killed, and the House decided that what we'll do is we'll put the psilocybin in with it. In this case, it didn't work because the Senate decided to kill their puppy. right? So they had their Senate bill come back. It came with the same language that they passed, but it also had the psilocybin stuff in it, so they decided to kill their puppy, all right? This is actually a fairly solid negotiating tactic, and this is just how politics works. As much as we'd like it for every bill to just stick to a single topic, at the end of the day, politics is political, and it ends with some push and shove. It gives some give and take, and it just is what it is. And even if we found a way to get rid of that, there's always the budget. The budget has to touch all these subjects anyway. So the way it works in New Hampshire is that the bills that pass the House become germane to every other bill that's in the House. So if a Senate bill comes over and House passed language in the past, that language is now germane to every other bill that is in the House. And I'm okay with that because I can't see, certain things can't happen without that sort of thing. You need to have some horse trading, otherwise the market doesn't work.
I've seen too much bad stuff that happens because it got thrown into the big, beautiful budget type nonsense.
That's true. It's sort of like a firearm, right? A firearm isn't inherently evil in and of itself. It can be used to do good or it can be used to do bad things. So basically, if you're going to have an omnibus or you're going to have a bill where you're mixing things over, you want your team in charge of deciding whether it's good or bad versus the bad guys. Hopefully you win, not them. Hey, you, who are you?
Hello. Thank you for the endorsement, first off. Secondly, I'm wondering your position on focusing on the county races, specifically the county attorney and the county sheriff, which have enormous power, which I'm not going to get into now, but they can really shut things down. So we have 10 counties in New Hampshire. As Meatloaf said, 1 out of 10 ain't bad. So I'm curious if it's worthwhile to look into that in the general NHLA universe of which you are part of.
So I have spoken with the NHLA board about this when I was in the NHLA board. I no longer am, and maybe the new board members have a different opinion on the subject. However, the idea at the time was dismissed because there was no way to have solid accountability. It would take a ridiculous amount of work. So whereas the legislature, you're voting on a specific bill, and you're saying this bill's good, this bill's bad, and we can rank that and put that and make statistics and make a scorecard out of it, how are you going to do that for a sheriff? You know? And so I'm in favor of doing that, and I'm willing to endorse if the candidate's good, which you are. Then, but again, I don't speak for the NHLA, but that was their opposition at the time. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, you have free time. Good luck, everybody.